Omari, my guy, man, how are you doing? We've been waiting so long to do this.
I'm great, Bryce. Like you said, we've been talking about doing this for so long, and it's a little surreal to finally be sitting here on the mic.
Hello and welcome to the very first episode of your new go-to Detroit Pistons podcast, The Pistons Pulse, co-hosted by me, Bryce Simon of Motor City Hoops, a former D1 hooper, current high school coach, teacher, husband, and father of 3 amazing kids, and Omari Sankofa II, Pistons beat writer for the Detroit Free Press.
Here we are. We've been planning this, it seems like, for 4 months now, and I look back and checked the first DM that we sent to set this up, and it was October 22nd, so almost exactly 4 months from today. And the team's been playing better basketball as of late, so I think there's a lot for us to dig into.
Absolutely. It's going to be a fun first segment, and we've had 3 really good games post All-Star break to dive into. And I just real quick, it seems like it's been so much longer than 4 months whenever I reached out and it just trying to put this all together. And the Pistons Pulse is brought to you by the Detroit Free Press, and that's why it took a little bit longer, because they wanted to make sure they got everything in line and we got this thing rolling the right way, and we're finally getting the first episode out to you. And we'll bring you weekly engaging conversations and unique perspectives on your Detroit Pistons and the NBA. Omari and I will bring you the best in-depth analysis, insights, and opinions on all the news and storylines surrounding the team. Please make sure you are following us on all social media platforms, especially Twitter, at Motor City Hoops for me, at Omari Sankofa for Omari, and at Freep Sports. And make sure you subscribe to Freep.com. Also, do us a favor, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, leave us a rating, comment, and tell a friend about the Pistons Pulse podcast. Omari and I both enjoy engagement from our listeners, so always feel free to reach out with comments about what you hear on the podcast. On today's episode, we'll discuss what we want to see post All-Star break from the Pistons roster, give our top 5 NBA draft prospects, and finish off with our and one segment to answer a few mailbag questions. But first, as Omari alluded to, the Pistons have won 3 of 4, and Sunday night's game was an overtime thriller, finished off by a Kelly Olynyk game winner. Let's start with that, Omari. What did you think about that game?
I mean, it was a really good win for them, for one. For them to lose, I mean, it doesn't even sound real when you say it out loud, but 15 straight games against the Charlotte Hornets, a team that, I mean, really up until this season, I've sort of been in the same category as the Pistons being a rebuilding team. And even during the front half of that losing streak, the Pistons were firmly in playoff contention. So just to get that streak off of their backs, I think was really good. It predates everybody on the roster. It predates Dwayne Casey. So I actually don't even know how much that was on their minds, versus us media or fans who have been watching it a little bit longer. But just a good win overall. Cade Cunningham got in foul trouble again, but he had a good game. I think he scored 12 of his 19 points in the fourth quarter, and we've seen that from him repeatedly this season, him being able to just flip that switch and deliver those clutch moments when necessary. Saddiq Bey started and finished the game really strong. He had 13 in the first quarter. I believe he had 7 points in the last minute of the fourth and in OT. Just to see so many players step up. Of course, the Kelly Olynyk game winner, that was only the 3rd time this season he scored 20 points. And it's just really been a rough season for him with the knee injury and, of course, COVID as well. But I thought he really needed that moment last night. He got 20 points and 8 rebounds. And I guess the overall takeaway for me is just this team has not been healthy all year. Jeremy and Kelly have both missed significant time. And you've had guys like Killian, Cade, Sadiq, Isaiah, stepping into bigger roles than players their age normally step into. But the team winning 3 of its last 4, I think we're just seeing the team healthy and finally starting to gel after dealing with so much this year.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is everybody wanted to talk about the losing streak versus the Bucks, right, Omari? Like that one was always highlighted. And then it was the Hornets one, and I think it was our guy Wes Davenport who kind of put me on that the Hornets one was pretty long in itself. So it was nice to finally get that one. I agree. I thought Saddiq Bey was clutch in this game. Obviously, we're going to talk about Jeremy Grant because we're going to really get into what we want to see from some guys on this roster post All-Star break through the rest of the season. So we're going to talk about Jeremy Grant, but I thought he made some big plays as well. He kind of took over overtime. I think he had 7 points in overtime. And the Kelly Olynyk game winner, I went back and watched it. They ran that same sideline out of bounds set either against the Cavs or against the Celtics. And they went to the same one, and the Hornets sniffed it out, and Kelly Olynyk kind of broke it off, Hayes hit him, and it was a tough shot, but he was able to knock it down. And it was just an exciting win and a great game for Detroit. Like, I think you tweeted out, like, it was just a good game in general.
It was a good game in general. And I think they've had a few good games in general over the last couple of weeks, which is just an improvement for them because they've had some games that were pretty much unwatchable. I mean, they lost their first two games against the Hornets by 29 and 22 points. So last night was really a complete turnaround for them. But you mentioned that out of bounds play, and it's funny because Kelly mentioned after the game that Dwayne has had them run through that play and practice and then shoot around just over and over and over to get it down, and it paid off because the Hornets, as you said, took away their first option, and Killian made the right read, got the ball to Kelly, and Kelly did his job and knocked down the shot at the buzzer. So it's just things like that. I mean, Kelly just hasn't been in the rotation for most of the season because he's been hurt. And he's the only center on the roster that can really shoot. And in a moment like that, it makes a big difference being able to put him in over a guy like Isaiah, who, I mean, also still had a really great game last night. But those small things matter. And it's like I said earlier, we're just seeing this team just reach a level of depth and I think a level of chemistry that they just haven't had for most of the season.
Yeah, and so for the listeners, that play was supposed to go to Saddiq Bey. They have a curl, and then Saddiq comes back through what I call an elevator screen through the middle of two guys screening for him. And I'm actually going to steal this play for my high school team as we go into the playoffs here this week and into, hopefully we'll continue into next week. But it's a nice little sideline out of bounds. But it is nice to see guys be able to break off and kind of, whenever the other team takes it away, still execute something. But let's move into what we want to see. So there's 21 games left as our listeners are able to listen to this recording. And Cade Cunningham, solid game, but the foul trouble snuck up again. We can start there. We can start with the positives. What do we need to see? What do you want to see from Cade Cunningham these last 20 or so games?
I think the big thing for Cade is just keeping the foul trouble under control. I believe 5 of his last 7 games, he's picked up 2 fouls in the first quarter. And he's played pretty well through that stretch, but we saw Saturday night, or actually I think that was Friday night against the Boston Celtics. He had to sit a lot of the fourth quarter because he had 5 fouls. And that was a big difference against the Hornets. He had 4 going into the fourth quarter. So Dwayne Casey didn't have to be as mindful about saving him for the end of the game. And as I mentioned earlier, he scored 12 points. And he also had a really good defensive stand against LaMelo Ball. I think with about a minute to play. And LaMelo ended up traveling and Ball went back to Detroit. But he's got to keep the fouls under control. I think he's gotten a tight whistle at times. He definitely had one on Sunday. But he still has to be mindful of just how he's defending. He tends to be a little handsy. And it's like an easy thing to fix. I mean, when you're a rookie, you're going to have just small stuff like that. You have to tighten up, but that's something he has to learn. Like I'm Cade Cunningham. Teams are going to try to bait me into those fouls, and I have to keep myself available for the entire game because they probably don't win against the Hornets if Cade has 5 fouls and he has to sit most of the fourth. And, we saw it on Friday as well. He had to sub out and then sub immediately back in because I think the Celtics went on a 15-3 run that really clinched the game for them. So beyond fouls, I would say cut down on turnovers as well because he usually has a couple passes a game where it's kind of hard to parse what he was going for or you can parse it, but the entire defense read what he was going to do. Beyond that, I mean, I think Cade's really checked a lot of the boxes you want to see from the number 1 pick, but those 2 things have stood out.
So, Omari, that game was actually on Saturday night. And I only bring this up because I found out over the last couple of weeks with Omari texting back and forth that he never knows what day it is.
I never know what day it is.
It's not like me, who's a teacher, like Monday through Friday, you know when Monday is because it's the start of the week. Like if we don't have school on a Monday, then sometimes my week is messed up. But for you, the games always fall on a different day. So that Celtics game was on Saturday, but listeners, don't hold it against Omari with the way his schedule is in his travel. It's hard to keep track. But yeah, I think Cade's poise is what I love. Even with the foul trouble, even when he has a bad shooting half, like you almost always see him make up for it in the second half. And that's not easy to do for a young player. I want to ask, I need a favor though. I need you to ask Coach Casey if he can get a technical arguing for Cade Cunningham to get some of these calls, man. Because I do think he's been getting a bad whistle, but he does need to grow up with that a little bit and learn from it. in terms of when to reach, when not to reach, and those type of things, and kind of just valuing every possession.
Sure. I was just going to reiterate that. He did get a really tough whistle against the Hornets. I thought a lot of those calls were at best 50-50 calls, but it just puts extra pressure on him to recognize I may not get a fair whistle all night. So I have to cut the really bad ones out for sure. Because I thought on Saturday, not Friday, he didn't have a sight of a whistle. And I would say that first game against the Celtics a couple weeks ago as well, he picked up 2 fouls in the first minute of the game. And to me, both of those were pretty obvious fouls. So there's some give and take, but there's also opportunities for sure where sometimes you may just have to tell the ref, hey, I'm playing as fair of a game as I can. And I know the coaching staff will go to bat for Cade when it's necessary. So.
Absolutely. And those Celtics, those 2 games, like the beginnings, his foul trouble were almost the exact same scenarios. And it has a little bit to do with matchups. He's trying to guard Jason Tatum. And that's something we can talk about on future episodes in terms of what this team needs to add to maybe protect him. Not because he's a bad defender, but so he's not guarding the other team's best player, along with everything else he's trying to do offensively on the boards and all of those things. But let's talk about a player who unfortunately did not get to play on Sunday night. And that's Marvin Bagley III, the one guy that came in at the trade deadline for the Pistons. He's looked good. I think he's got to play 4 games, a couple before the All-Star break, a couple since, rolled an ankle on a lob attempt from Killian Hayes in that game on Saturday against the Celtics. What have you seen from Marvin Bagley III that you've either liked, would like to see more of from him in these last 20-plus games?
So the big thing that stood out about Marvin is that he is an athletic center, and that's something that the Pistons haven't had this season. For him to be able to come in and just operate out of the dunker spot, function as a lob threat, it's certainly opened up the floor in a way for Detroit's ball handlers. I mean, we saw Cade against the Celtics make a point to look for Marvin when the defense kind of choked up, and they also ran some knob plays for him. So he's immediately stepped in and made an impact as a scorer, and I think that's been felt. One thing I would like to see from him, and I think he'll pick this up, is just rebounding a little bit better. He hasn't been an especially strong rebounder for the Pistons for the few games he's played. Historically in the NBA and even in college, he's been a pretty good rebounder, so I don't think that's going to be a recurring issue. And then defensively, he's a bit of a tweener. He doesn't quite have the foot speed to stay in front of guys on switches and on the perimeter. And he doesn't quite have the instincts you would want from a rim protector as far as just protecting the paint. So even if he's never a guy that's going to be able to switch easily, you would like to see him protect the rim a little bit better, and that's probably a big one, along with the rebounding.
Absolutely. And that's when I did a breakdown on him, I dove into the film right away when that trade happened. And I thought rebounding, I think especially offensively, that's where he really thrives. Like, he's a very aggressive offensive rebounder. And we've seen that at times, but I don't know that he's going to be a major plus defender. And so I think if he can help on the rebounds, that's a huge thing he can bring to the table, because offensively, he is very skilled. I do want to make a quick note, and I want to know if you agree with this. I don't think he's a bad defender because of lack of effort or want to. Like, he just doesn't have very good defensive awareness. You can see him engaged. He's in a stance. He's trying to guard. But as many people know, like, basketball IQ just doesn't come natural to everybody. You don't see the rotation whenever, early enough to make it happen. And I think that's the biggest issue with him. And I just kind of wonder how easy it's going to be to improve upon that, where he's already 3 years into his NBA career.
I agree with that. Marvin plays with effort. I think there's a willingness for him to get better in that area. And we've seen big men improve with time. I don't think Brook Lopez had a reputation as a great rim protector when he first came into the league, but that's something he improved on immensely, along with his 3-point shooting. But that is an area Marvin can improve in. And some guys just have that natural knack to be able to do it, and some guys don't. But just with experience and repetition, Marvin was in a situation in Sacramento where he wasn't getting consistent playing time toward the end. He's had injuries here and there. So it hasn't been a particularly smooth 3.5 seasons in the NBA for him so far, but it's not from a lack of want to. It's just, I think he just has to get the reps and develop those instincts, and that's something that can come with time.
Absolutely. Let's talk about a guy who did not get traded at the trade deadline, and to be quite honest, maybe the guy that was a very surprising non-participant at the trade deadline, and maybe even some Pistons fans wanted to see him traded, were even disappointed that he wasn't, and that's Jeremy Grant. And he did have a really nice second half on Sunday night in that win, as I alluded to earlier. In overtime, I believe he had 7 points. Like, it was in a few possessions too. He kind of took over there in overtime. What do you think we are going to see? What do you want to see from Jeremy Grant? Because I know for me, I want to see him embrace this role as not the primary creator, not a primary scorer. Almost, I hate to say this, Omari, but fall back into what he was before he came to Detroit. And he may not like that, but that's what I think he's going to be if he ends up staying with this team long term. And I know a lot of people think he'll get traded in the offseason. That very well may happen. Let's not get into that right now, but just what do you want to see from Jeremy here at the end of the season?
I think Rose sort of in between the two probably makes the most sense for this Pistons team because, I mean, on one hand, we saw Jeremy at the end of the Charlotte game. He had 7 points in overtime, and they probably don't win that game if Jeremy doesn't do that because there was a point where Charlotte took a 5-point lead, and Dwayne Casey said after the game, and I agree, a month or two ago, the Pistons probably would have just folded in that moment. And they did it, and they did it because Jeremy, I think he either knocked down a three and then hit a shot from mid-range right after, or the other way around. But he kept the Pistons afloat. And for the Pistons to have 2 or 3 guys who can hit those types of tough shots late in games, along with Cade, and of course we saw Sadiq do it as well, it's really key, and it makes a big difference when you have 3 guys who are rolling like that. Because for most of the season, the Pistons have often only had maybe one guy fulfilling that role with Jeremy out. So that's really important. I would say the flip side of that is Jeremy's not a primary ball handler. That's Cade, and you want the ball in Cade's hands because he just has the court awareness and vision to make plays not only for himself but for others as well. And Jeremy, like as good as he was scoring, he also had that turnover when he was trying to find Sadiq in the corner. And he turned the ball over on the inbounds at the end of the fourth quarter, too. That almost gave the game away. If LaMelo was a little bit more aware of the clock, I mean, he probably could have went for a layup or drew a foul. There's a lot of things he could have done instead of taking that mid-range shot with 2 seconds left. Again, like I don't think Jeremy necessarily needs to go back to what he was in Denver, but if he sort of sharpened his vision a little bit and was able to be that secondary creator, I think it would go a long way toward sort of easing that fit between him, Sadiq, and Cade.
So I think the things I want to see him do better, Omari, is I would like to see him be like a lockdown defender. And I know he's a good defender, but like I just want to see him really guard the other team's best player. And I know he can't match up with everybody. And then I really want to see him get on the boards, more involved on the defensive boards. Is that something Coach Casey, I believe there was a quote early in the season, maybe preseason, from Coach Casey about Jeremy getting more involved on the boards, but I don't think we've really seen it. So is that something that's being talked about? Is that something you've seen in terms of Jeremy Grant, maybe defensively, but especially as a defensive rebounder?
As far as the rebounding, that's something that the team has talked about, wanting to see him be more effective at doing. But you know, some guys are just not strong rebounders, and Jeremy just may not be a guy who's going to be a strong rebounder. Historically, you just look at his career, he's never really been a guy that's crashed the boards, and his rebounding this season is pretty much in line with what he did not only last season, but just throughout his career when you look at the rebounding percentages. So, you know, I don't want to say he's a tweener in that way. You know, he's 6'9", so his natural position is probably power forward, but he plays a little bit more of a perimeter-oriented game, and you know, and he just doesn't really have like that rebounding instinct. So when he's on the floor, you want to pair him with other guys who rebound pretty well. You know, and of course, Isaiah's a pretty good rebounder, and Cade, you know, for a 6'6" guard / wing, is one of the best rebounders in the league at his size.
Sadiq has done a good job of that.
Sadiq has made a leap as a rebounder this season for sure as well. He had those 2 offensive rebounds late against the Hornets that were huge. And he's definitely made a step forward in that regard. So Dwayne always talks about having a gang rebounding mentality, and that makes up for it to an extent. But at this point, like it's probably just safe to say that that's probably not something that Jeremy's going to give you.
Hamidou Diallo. This is the last guy we're going to talk about before we get into, I know what a lot of people want to listen to, and that's the NBA draft. It's an exciting time, and we're going to get there in just a few minutes, guys. But Hamidou Diallo, a guy that has really endeared himself, I feel like, to a lot of Pistons fans. He had the good stretch whenever, COVID was ravishing the league and, eventually hit the Pistons, had some big games. I think he settled in nicely into the second unit. I think, personally, that's where he is going to have the most success and sustained success. Is there anything you'd like to see from Hami here over the last 20 games that you want to see continue? Maybe something that he could add to his game. Shooting is probably going to be an off-season thing, but anything you'd like to see from Hamidou Diallo?
I think Hami's been one of the biggest bright spots of the season. And for him, it's just to keep this momentum going, for him to be able to come in, immediately bring that energy off of the bench. And he's just such a fun player to watch. He's a guy that knows exactly how athletic he is and what he could do. And you can tell he really relishes, those alley-oop dunks or whatever it may be that gets the crowd riled up. Nobody else on this team really has his skill set. And he's really learned how to leverage that this season, and just his consistency from night to night and him being able to give you a consistent, like 10 to 13 points off the bench every night. Pressure the rim, which is something that you don't get as much from Killian and Cade. He's really thrived in his role, and for him, it's just to keep it going. You would like to see him shoot the ball a little bit better, but as you said, I think that's more of an off-season thing for him. I also think he could be a more consistent defender. I think he has the tools to be a really good defender, but just the possession-to-possession awareness isn't always there. So if I had to task him with one thing, it would probably be that. But I really can't nitpick Hamdi at all because he came in at the trade deadline last year and, didn't get a big deal over the offseason, but he's really come in and, showed that he's an NBA player and he's really valuable for this team. So he just needs to keep it going.
Absolutely. That was a great trade by Troy Weaver acquiring Hamidou Diallo. I don't want to say he's like a core member of this roster, but I do think he's a guy that ends up staying around and growing with this team. As you said, he has a skill set, even just with his athleticism, that nobody else on the roster really has. I think that makes him valuable. And I like what he brings for the second unit and kind of what we're seeing from that second unit in general as this team starts to get healthy with Killian Hayes, with Marvin Bagley III, even Kelly Olynyk if he can continue to play better. But in the next segment, we're going to talk about a player who maybe could slide into the starting lineup next season. So please stay with us as we come back from this short break. And Omari and I are each going to give our top 5 NBA draft prospects for the 22 NBA draft class.
All right. Hey, Carlos, just a quick idea. How about if I say, hey, this is Sean Windsor, and you say, hey, this is Carlos Morales, and I'll go, and then we'll go back. You want to try that?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. You ready?
Yep.
Hey, this is Sean Windsor.
And this is Carlos Benares.
And we are the team behind Free Press Sports with Carlos and Sean, where we are going to talk about, you guessed it, sports, but lots of other stuff. Like what, Carlos?
Oh, we're going to talk about your favorite subject, Sean, food. Probably more food. Arts, culture, sports, TV, movies, you name it. If it's happened in Detroit, we're going to talk about it.
And sometimes we're going to have guests in who obviously know a lot more than we do about just about everything. But we're going to have some free press journalists to talk about big stories, folks from the sports world. We're going to be out every Thursday. You can find this podcast wherever you find your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts. We hope you'll join us.
All right, Omari. So a couple weeks ago, you dropped an article, and I believe that article was actually who you felt like the Pistons had at the top of their draft board. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I'm eventually probably for the next, week-ish or so, come out with a more proper big board as far as where I think the Pistons are right now in their thinking. Because that was just more of a mailbag question. Didn't want to unload the entire clip right then. But I think I put Chet at the top of that draft board. And I mean, of course, I think he's still hugely in consideration for the number 1 pick right now. But that was more so where I think the Pistons are, more so than myself. And this would be my personal top 5 draft board, as yours as well.
Yeah, so that's what I wanted to make that distinction for the listener. So if you read that article and then you're like, what? Omari just said 2 weeks ago that, Chet was at the top of it. And I don't know. That's the other thing I want to tell our listeners. Neither of us have told each other where we're going with this top 5. So for this segment, Omari is going to give his personal top 5. Again, this is not what any intel or anything for him or what he thinks. That this is solely what he thinks. And then obviously I don't have any intel anyway. So this is 100% what I think for my top 5. We're going to each give our 1 through 5, and then we're going to go back and forth a little bit talking about the differences or maybe the similarities. And just for I actually changed mine this morning. I did text Omari that, I think, and told him I changed my top 5 this morning. But Omari, I'm going to let you go first. So start with number 1, work to 5, and then I'll give you mine.
So my number 1 is Chet. My number 2 is Paolo.
Okay.
Number 3, I'm sorry. My number 2 is Jabari.
Oh,
and my number 3 is Paolo. And my number 4 is Jaden Ivey. And then my number 5 is tough because there's a lot of guys who are sort of in that similar tier. But right now, if the Pistons had the 5th pick and I were in control, I would probably go Keegan Murray with that 5th pick.
Ooh, okay. So, wow. Keegan, okay. All right. I'll give mine and then we'll get into this. And I do want to ask, okay, real quick before do you have your guys in tiers? Like, I know that's a big thing with the draft stuff now is you put them in tiers. I actually do have my guys in tiers, especially here at the top. Like if there was a breaking point, would you have one with these guys or would you have 2 possibly?
I think there would be 3. I think Jabari and Chet would be in that first tier. Paolo and Jaden Ivey in that second tier. And then I think Keegan Murray is in that third tier with a few other guys. But just his productivity, I think, kind of puts him in the lead for now for me.
Okay, perfect. So we are going to have a little bit of difference, but actually our tiers break at the same point. So I actually have Jabari Smith Jr. number 1. I have Chet number 2, and that is my tier 1. And this is where I made a change because up until this morning, I had Paolo in that tier 1 with those 2 guys. But now it's Jabari 1, Chet 2. I have Paolo 3, Jaden Ivey 4, just like you. I have those guys in a tier by themselves. And then at number 5, I have actually Adrian Griffin Jr. from Duke as well. But I'm with you. He is in that third tier with a handful of other guys. So if we have time here, we may at least list those guys and kind of tease that for an upcoming episode where we get into that next tier. Because there is a chance for our listeners, the Pistons, if they finish with the 3rd worst record, which is possible, they could draft as low as 7, I believe. There's a possibility. It's not a very good possibility, but there is a chance there. But let's stay with our top 5. So we both have Chet and Jabari in that top tier. We have a different 1-1. I want to start with you. What do you love about Chet Holmgren that you have him number 1?
I think the thing about Chet is just how productive he is. And he's been so productive this season that although I do love Jabari Smith as well, again, I think you can make an argument for either of these guys number 1 and you wouldn't be wrong. But I worry that, some people may be just overthinking Chet a little bit. And I think the point that people would probably differ on the most is whether or not, 1, can he put on weight? And 2, if he can't put on weight, how much does that impact his effectiveness at the NBA level? But for me, you have a guy who's averaging about 15 and 10, almost 4 blocks. He can handle the ball. He's got great vision. He's knocking down 44% of his threes this season on pretty good volume. He's taking about 3.5 per game. And just to compare him and Paolo, they're taking around the same number of threes per game. And, Chet's shooting it almost 15 percentage points better. You could debate, Chet's in a weaker conference, this and that. But between that, and he's also shot his free throws pretty well too. I think his 3-point shot's pretty legit. He's huge. He's got a huge wingspan. You look at him just as a guy who could rotate, inside the perimeter, maybe even switch a little bit. I could go on all day. I just think he does so much that it's just hard to see how he fails. I think he's an extremely safe pick, despite me and him probably being close to the same weight, even though he's got about a foot on me. And just a guy who checks as many boxes as he checks. It's just hard for me to look at that and say, I'm going to go in a different direction. I think he's, pretty close to being a sure thing.
Okay. So just for our listeners, in case you don't know, I don't want to offend anybody, but Chet Holmgren is out of Gonzaga, 7'1", less than 200 pounds. I don't know what his weight actually is, but everything I've listened to and looked up, it's less than 200. 7'6" wingspan, and like this dude just blocks everything. I think what's the new nickname, the Venus flytrap or something, because he gobbles up everything around the rim. He's a drop coverage big. There's a lot of comparisons to Evan Mobley, which I want to ask you about in just a second, Omari, as we stay on Chet Holmgren. But what I love, and you brought up, and this is why he continues to move up my board, Omari, is like the offensive skill set is real. Like, it's real. Like, he can grab and go. He's a really good shooter. He's a really good passer. Even if he can't create, he's at least going to be able to make plays in the short roll and be a connector. And if he can shoot, he's too tall to block it. Like, you can't really contest it. And here's the other thing. I continue to hear people say he's tough, he's competitive, he doesn't back down, he's an elite competitor and strong character guy. Like, that's Troy Weaver's type of players to me, like to a T. So I could see Troy Weaver really loving Chet Holmgren. But what do you think about the Evan Mobley comparison?
I like it. I think Mobley, for one, he's a little bit bigger. Like, they're both not like the biggest dudes from like a size standpoint, other than being 7 feet tall. But I think Mobley moves a little bit better. So I like Mobley's potential to defend the perimeter. I mean, we've seen it this season already, so it's not like you have to project. But I think Mobley's probably a little bit more switchable. But by the same token, Chet shot the three a lot better in college, and like right off the bat, it could be a better shooter than Mobley in the NBA as well. So I think there's a lot of similarities between them. They're a little bit different. Like, Mobley may be a little bit of a better passer as well. I mean, I think you're getting a prospect who's not that far off from Evan Mobley, and Mobley was considered to be one of the best big man prospects to come out. I mean, really since Anthony Davis, almost a decade ago now. That's just like, it's just tough to get big men like Chet. And I think that's the other thing for me is that, typically you have one of these guys in each draft, and it's often guys that you have to gamble on to an extent too. Like, you look at Rudy Gobert, he was like the 27th pick. You look at Giannis, like he was right outside the lottery. I'm not saying he's going to be, like that type of player. But if you have a chance to get a transformational big, who could potentially get to that tier, it's tough for me to pass up on it. So that's why he's my number one.
And so I just do want, like, that's one thing whenever you think about the Chet and Mobley comparisons for our listeners is Chet is widely regarded as more of a drop big, not a guy that's going to switch a lot. And Mobley is, kind of known to be a little more agile, a little bit better foot speed. But I think Chet's offensive game is beyond Mobley's, at least at the same point in their careers. You said you think you don't see really a world where Chet fails, and you called him the safe pick. So I want to use that to transition to Jabari Smith Jr. at Auburn, freshman, 6'10", 7'1" wingspan. I have Jabari number one because I'm a little, that's my mentality. Omari as a person, like, I want the guy that's a safe bet, even though he may not have as much upside. And that's why I have Jabari Smith as my number one. Is like, I just think his shooting is elite, especially for his size, maybe even if he wasn't his size, but he just hits unreal shots. He hits them at a high rate. And I just don't see a world where that doesn't translate. And then defensively, he is switchable. He plays with pride on the defensive end. He rebounds. Like, I just think that maybe his ceiling isn't as high as Chet's, but I think his floor is much higher than maybe any of these other top guys we're talking about.
I could get behind that. I texted one of my buddies a few weeks ago, and we were talking about Jabari. And I said that I think Jabari's floor, and by floor, I mean like basement, like, like this is, he will at least be this if everything else goes wrong. Is Rashard Lewis,
yep.
Right? And Rashard Lewis is above average power forward, obviously. But I think that's the starting point for Jabari because you mentioned he's such a great shooter already. And he's so young, too. I mean, I think he's the youngest of all those guys who are going to go in the top 4 or 5. He's 6'7". He just shoots it so well. Like, it's hard to pass on. And he's got the tools to be a really good defender. He's not a good shooter just, from three, but even inside the arc as well. And the only question mark with him, I think, is does he develop enough of a dribble drive game to be able to pressure the rim as well? But even if he doesn't become that, you talk about a guy who's going to be a above average stretch big and at least an average defender for his entire career. And that's just a really great starting point, especially considering that, I think he's still 18 years old.
Yeah, so that's definitely the biggest knock, and I think it's a real knock. Like as I've watched more games, if I've got a chance, like over All-Star break, to get away from watching the Pistons quite as much, where they weren't playing games, and got to watch some of these college guys. Like it's real. Like the handle isn't very creative. There's not a bunch of self-creation. He doesn't create a ton of separation, even with his shot, even though he just has a ridiculous ability to knock down tough shots. So there's definitely some truth to that. But like you said, he's very young. So is that something he can develop? Let's keep it moving here. And guys, we are going to continue to talk about these guys, especially at the top, as we move forward through the next few weeks. And we'll talk more about how they fit with Cade and Detroit, and who we think Coach Casey may like, who Troy Weaver may like, those type of things. We'll give those perspectives as well. But this is just kind of the intro. Like, we're just giving you the appetizer for NBA draft talk on the Pistons Pulse this week. So let's go to what we both have as the same second tier. And I labeled this, I'm still excited about these two guys in my tier 2. And I think we both had Paolo Banchero, the Duke Blue Devils, 6'10", 250. What do you like about Paolo, and why do you not have him in tier 1?
So the thing about Paolo is that he's just a bucket. I mean, like inside the arc, like he could just kill you in so many ways, whether it's posted up. I mean, he's got, pretty good touch, like anywhere from mid-range. I mean, he's really big, 250, so he can play bully ball. He rebounds. He's got pretty decent vision. He's certainly a guy that, I think his floor is pretty high too. Maybe you would compare him to, maybe like a Julius Randle type.
Yes,
where,
yes.
You can kind of run offense through him, and, he can hit open shooters. Like, he could get you a consistent, 22, 24 points a game. There's a lot to like about him offensively. And I think my question marks are, one, does he ever get an NBA jump shot? Because he's at 29% right now. And that's actually going down a little bit since, the conference season started. I think he was in the low 30s early on. And also defensively, is he a switchable guy, or is he a guy that you're going to drop because you don't know what else to do with him? Like, so he's not a drop big. It's more of we're dropping him because we don't want him to get killed on switches all game. But beyond that, like, I think there's a lot to like about his offensive game. And, I think he's a guy that, just looking at these guys as rookie seasons, he'll probably have a huge advantage for being, rookie of the year, just because I think he'll come in and immediately be a 17 to 18 points per game scorer.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen the Julius Randle comparison as well. One thing I just want to add to that as a positive, because I had the same negatives, right? The defending thing. And to me, he's a little bit too much ISO. Like, where's the off-ball movement? Can he stretch the floor and knock down threes? So those are the big negatives with Paolo Banchero. But I do think he's a good passer. So that's a big thing. And, if he can play in the mid post and draw a double team, he's going to be able to pass out of that. If he plays in the, ball screen and short roll, he's going to be able to pass out of it. And I'm interested even to watch some more Duke games and see how much he can play actually as the ball handler in ball screen situations, because I've even heard people talk about that with him. But let's talk about a guy that's a true guard, and that's Jaden Ivey. We both have him as number 4 on our board, both in tier 2 behind Paolo. He's a 6'4" sophomore out of Purdue. What do you like about Jaden Ivey?
I mean, he's just an electric athlete for one. He's one of the best athletes in the draft, if not the best athlete in the draft. Yeah, I mean, just his change of pace, the way he's able to pressure the rim. His shooting has improved this season, and he's not a great shooter, but I think he's shown enough this season to where you could probably feel pretty good that he'll at least, eventually become league average in the NBA, which helps the stock a lot. But just, to be able to add a guy who's that athletic, just plays with that much aggression. I think he's a guy that, from day one, he'll be able to make an impact. He's got pretty good tools for defense as well, although he can improve defensively. For him, I think he's a little bit more of an upside play compared to Paolo. But, I mean, just the tools he has to be an elite scorer in the NBA, it's pretty, I think he's a guy that you would absolutely want to gamble on if you're in that 3rd or 4th spot.
I agree. I think there's a lot of upside, right? Like, that's what it is with Jaden Ivey. I think those guys above Jaden Ivey, you feel like there's a floor that makes them still pretty successful. Like, not what you'd want from pick 1, 2, or 3 in the NBA draft. But with Jaden Ivey, there's a little more swing for the fence with him. I know we don't want to get into this too much. I think he's a really nice fit next to Cade if he can come along with what you talked about, which is on the defensive end. I think that would be huge for him because actually he does play off the ball quite a bit at Purdue, which fits perfect, right? Like that's a lot of the concerns with Jaden Ivey offensively are with the ball in his hands too much. Well, he wouldn't have to do that in Detroit next to Cade. You know, the 3-point shooting was really, really good, and then it hasn't been good in the month of February. So it'll be interesting to watch the end of the year conference tournament, NCAA tournament, if the 3-point shooting comes around. But my biggest thing with Jaden Ivey is like you said, he should have the tools with the athleticism and the wingspan, but is he actually going to do that? Because if he does, I think he turns into a really nice fit next to Cade Cunningham for Detroit. But he is just absolutely electric. And one final point here before we move to our number 5 guys is he plays in an offense where like they have 2 traditional bigs. That lane is not open very much in Purdue, Omari.
It's not, and I think it's a little bit of a cliche, a little bit to say that the game's going to get easier for guys when they get to the league because of improved spacing. But yes, the NBA generally has better spacing in college. And I would say even the Pistons, who have shot the ball pretty poorly this season, have much better spacing than, Purdue, because their offense always revolves around bigs. Ours the biggest team in the Big Ten, in the conference that, usually has good big guys anyway. And, he's playing with an extremely crowded lane and he's still making an impact. So, yeah, I think Jaden Ivey's a guy. There's definitely a chance that day one in the NBA, he's probably a lot better than you might expect. It's just because, he's got that elite first step and there's not too many guys who can stay in front of him. And you mentioned the fit with Cade too, and not that the Pistons should draft for fit, but, I think another knock with Jaden Ivey is that he's not quite a lead guard right now. Like he could make good reads, but that's not quite his game. And having Cade just kind of frees Jaden to do what he does best, which is attack the rim. So, there's just a lot to like there.
Let's go to the final one. You mentioned Big Ten big guys. Your number 5 guy is one of those. And I will say I have Keegan Murray number 9 on my board. He is the final guy in this tier 3, which for me, tier 3 is I'm happy, but it's not a game changer in this group. And again, we will get into a lot of these guys, including Keegan Murray and my guy, Adrian Griffin Jr. from Duke in future episodes, maybe even next week. But I just want to let you touch on Keegan Murray just a little bit here before we go to break and come back with our final segment.
Sure. So I think my argument for Keegan is similar to my argument for Chet, where, it's just a certain point where you're just so productive and so efficient in college that it's hard for me to make the case against taking him 5th overall. He's averaging 23 points a game. Like he's shooting the 3 pretty well, 36%. He's been really efficient inside the arc. 56% inside the arc. Like he's just a really strong, 6'8" forward. And maybe he's a bit of a tweener defensively, but just on offense, he could just kill you in so many different ways that, and even 2 blocks a game, 2 blocks, 1.3 steals, this dude is just a monster. And really the only knock is that he'll be close to 22 on draft night. And, there's teams who would prefer to go for upside over that. But I would just say if Keegan Murray were 19 instead of 22, or 20 instead of 22 on draft night, he would be firmly in the mix, I think, as they go top 4, with a pretty talented top 4. And, and seeing guys like Desmond Bane, he was pretty old coming into the draft, just coming in and be pretty good from day one, especially for a Pistons team that probably wants to compete sooner rather than later. I just think he makes a lot of sense.
He's a productive and efficient player. That's one of my notes on him. And again, guys, we are going to get into this whole list. Do you have real quick? Do you have Adrian Griffin ranked? Did you fill out your top 10 or did you just stop at 5?
No, I have a top 10. And if I were to, name my guys after Murray, Benedict would be in that group. I would also put AJ Griffin right in that group. So that's 7. And I also like Jalen Duren.
Yep.
Just being an extremely, active big man.
Johnny Davis.
And Johnny Davis, too. I love Johnny Davis. And if Keegan Murray were not my number 5, it would probably be Johnny, because I think he's really only a consistent 3 away from, really being a problem in the NBA. So all those guys are probably in the same tier for me, along with Sharp, if he declares.
Perfect. We're going to save the rest of that. That's our tier 3, and we're going to do that next episode, and we'll get to those guys. I'll be able to talk a little bit more about Adrian Griffin Jr. from Duke a little bit more, and we'll do that next week with that tier right there. But right now, okay, we're going to go to another little short break, and when we come back, we will do our And One segment to wrap up the episode. We'll answer one mailbag question picked by Omari, one by myself, and one by random draw during the recording.
Alyssa Robinson for the Detroit Free Press. When you wake up every morning, what's the first thing you do? Check your email? Me too. And when you sign up for our daily briefing newsletter, you'll get all the latest news sent directly to your inbox so you can wake up and be ready for the day. We also have newsletters about COVID-19 in Michigan, the latest entertainment headlines, as well as Woodward 248, a newsletter specifically for people living and working in Southeast Oakland County. And don't forget about automotive headlines and all the latest news from our Michigan sports teams. We have a newsletter for every personality and preference. Just head to freep.com/newsletters to sign up for any one of these great options and more.
So as we start the final segment of this episode, I want to thank everyone for their submissions. It was amazing. We really weren't sure how many we would get this first week of the Pistons Pulse, and we got quite a few. We got a lot, and we really appreciate that. It made it tough on Omari and myself to choose these that we each have. And just let us know if you'd like this to be a weekly segment. We've kind of planned on maybe weekly, maybe bi-weekly, depending on how the listeners like it. So let us know what you think. But Omari, I'm going to let you go first with the question you picked from the submissions.
Sure. So I got a question from @Tayshawn's Block on Twitter. What do you think the state of Troy Weaver's first draft class, or what do you think of the state of Troy Weaver's first draft class now that we are almost 2 years removed? What would you grade it, at which, if any of them don't get a second contract? So I would give that first class a B. I think Saddiq Bey and Isaiah Stewart, I think we can certainly say that they're NBA players and, definitely going to get that second contract. Just because they've already been pretty good, especially for two guys drafted outside of the lottery. Like both of these guys, I think Isaiah Stewart was 16th, Saddiq Bey is 19th. If you're doing a redraft, they both go top 15. So that's a big win. I think what drags the class down a little bit, and I still think he could figure it out, but Killian Hayes is not, if you're doing a redraft, he would probably not be a lottery pick right now. Of course, the Pistons took him 7th. And it's tough because his defense has absolutely been, I think, better than a lot of people expected. He's been the best perimeter defender on this team. And he's good with the ball, too. I think he reads the floor really well. And he's able to push the pace. Really, the only bad passes he makes are passes where it probably would have been better if he took the shot. And that's been the main issue with him this season, is just his lack of scoring. He doesn't pressure the rim. He's been shooting around 20. He's been between 20 and 25% from three since early in the season after a pretty good start. You see a lot of hesitation. Like there was a play last week against the Cavaliers where he had a wide open three and he thought about it and he passed the ball back to Hami. And Hami did call for it, but it was a contested layup and Hami missed it. And you got to take the three there. And it's just tough because I like Killian, and I think he still has a chance to be a really good NBA point guard. But it's tough to last in this league when you're a point guard that can't score. You at least have to have some second gear, whether it's being just like an energy guy and leader like Marcus Smart, who's never really been an offensive weapon consistently at least, or like a Rajon Rondo, where not only was he defensively really good, but we also saw that gear in the playoffs where he could pop off for 25, 30, 35 points when needed. So that's something Killian has to figure out. And whether or not he gets that second contract from the Pistons, I would put that as a TBD right now.
So I'm with you on that. I would say a B-, maybe C+. Just I don't know how to weigh those because, like you say, he really hit great picks with Bey and Stewart. I think Saddiq Bey is a long-term starter. That doesn't mean he's untradeable. I think sometimes fans equate that to each other. Like if Bey has to get packaged to get a higher level player, I would be okay with that. But I think he is an NBA starter, and I think he can be a starter on this team even whenever they're a playoff team. I still, even though Stewart's played well recently, I think he's a third big. I think he's your first big guy off the bench. And as we talked about earlier, come playoffs, that's going to be a very valuable big if with him as switchable as he is. Killian Hayes, I think, is the second unit point guard. Obviously, when you're a GM, you're not trying to draft a second unit point guard with the number 7 pick. So that was a pretty big miss. I know people always like to bring up Tyrese Halliburton, who got drafted after Killian Hayes, and I understand that. But as you said, there's still, room for growth. I think he's really, really good on the defensive end. And I'm sure we'll talk about him more as we go out through the rest of the regular season and into the offseason. The question I chose came from @discomfort_ on Twitter. And he says, in free agency 2023, so not this year, but a year from now, a little more than a year from now, who will have the most sway or influence in bringing a star free agent to Detroit? Cade Cunningham, Dwayne Casey, Arn Tellem, Troy Weaver, or other? And I'll give my quick answer, and then I'll let you go, Omari. I think it's absolutely Cade Cunningham and whoever possibly the 2022 draft pick is. Like if it's Chet, Jabari, those guys are going to make a major case for it also. I think that's the biggest draw of these options. I do think Troy Weaver probably has some good relationships out there, so he would be my number 2. I don't think Coach Casey is the coach of this team whenever they're in the playoffs. Whenever that happens, that's another segment for another day. But I think it's absolutely Cade Cunningham et al. In terms of other star players that may be on the roster.
I'll go with Cade as well. So this is free agency 2023, so it would be the end of Cade's second season.
Correct, yep.
Ideally Cade makes another leap towards stardom next season, and he establishes himself as a guy who could at least be a number 2, when this team is a perennial playoff team. And players generally want to play with other good players. I think, Aaron Tellem will always have some sway. Troy Weaver will have some sway. I think I'm probably higher on the job Dwayne Casey's done through this rebuild than a lot of people. So this isn't a knock on Dwayne, but generally you're not going to go to a team to play for a specific coach. There are some sure examples of that, but usually it's because you want to team up with a certain guy. And Cade, of course, is the guy on this team right now. So I think we're pretty aligned there.
Yeah. So, and I want to clear up what I said. I'm actually kind of known as a Dwayne Casey supporter or defender, I would think, in the Pistons community that I'm most familiar with. But I guess that was more me saying, I think right now Dwayne Casey is trying to turn these guys into pros, teach them the right way, all those type of things. I just wonder if Dwayne Casey is still the head coach 3-4 years from now, or if he doesn't move into a front office role. And again, guys, this isn't me with any sort of intel whatsoever. This is just an opinion as an outsider fan. And so that was more what I was saying with Coach Casey. He has his faults. He has some things that I would like to see done different. And again, we'll talk about those in future episodes. But let's move to our actual and one part, the final question, the and one question, Omari. And so we were doing this live as we record. We have 8 questions left here. And so I'm going to spin the wheel and we're just going to see a random number. Every question that's left has a random number assigned to it. And the random number is question number 2. So question number 2. So this is going to go back to Killian Hayes. This is from my guy @ShamShamGod. If you could bet the house on one, what role do you see Killian Hayes having in 5 years? Out of the league, end of rotation, 6th man, starter, first option, star, not on the Pistons.
So I don't know if this is cheating at all, but I think a couple of these kind of go with each other. In 5 years, I could certainly see him being a 6th man. It's just 5 years is a long time in the NBA. And I could see that not being on the Pistons simply because just on Killian's current growth trajectory, I could see a scenario almost like sort of a Cameron Payne where you do eventually become a really productive point guard. And of course, Phoenix has been the best team in the NBA this year, and Cameron Payne's been a big part of that. But Cameron Payne's not with the team that originally drafted him. And, and for the Pistons, they may have some judgment calls to make on Killian before Killian becomes the player he needs to be to last in the NBA. So, I guess I would go with 3 6 man, but just using this 5-year scenario, I'm not sure if the Pistons would want to wait 5 years for him to get there. So I'm going to pick two answers there. I don't know which direction you want to go with it, Bryce, but that's why I'm going to answer that.
No, I think that's fair because I think I'm going to go very similar. I still think he's a second unit point guard. I think he can be very good at it. I don't see starter unless the 3-point shot comes around or the mentality of finishing in the lane at the rim. He has to provide something offensively scoring wise. You talked about it earlier. I think the passing is solid. I do think he's a good passer, but he has to be able to score the ball a little bit to keep defenses honest to show that passing ability. So I have him as your 8th, 9th best player. Like he's one of he's your second of two guards in the second unit. And I also don't think he's on the Pistons. And my thing is, you got 3 guys in the same class. Like it was great. I'm sure, it was exciting that offseason for the Pistons to have 3 first-round picks. But then at a certain point, you have to pay all 3 of those first-round picks, in the same offseason. I'm not saying any of those guys are going to demand like a ton, but then Cade Cunningham's coming up the next year to get paid. And, we're talking about a free agent signing or a trade. And then, in this class, you're drafting high again as well. So I don't think there's any way all 3 of those guys stay on the roster long-term. And if I had to bet my house on it, and my wife loves our house, so I better make a smart decision, Omari. Okay. I'm saying second unit, not on the Pistons.
Yeah. And I think, again, I think Killian can figure it out, because even if he just had a consistent 3-ball or just got to the line consistently, something, I think he would pretty firmly be an NBA point guard, just because of the strength of his defense and the way he sees the floor. But he's got to give something else. And, there's pretty much a 4-year window where the Pistons can evaluate him and figure out, do we commit to him long-term or not. You already have another ball handler there on the team, in Cade Cunningham. If after this draft we end up with a guy like Jaden Ivey, he can only have so many hands on the rocks. So just from a timeline standpoint, I can see it not working out in Detroit, even if it does work out for Killian long term.
Absolutely. So again, thank you to everybody who submitted a question. It really meant a lot to us, all the support we've gotten for the Pistons Pulse leading up to this first episode. And I don't know about Omari, but I've just been smiling all day waiting to record this and then for it to drop. It's been in the works for so long. And now that we're here at the end of the episode, I had a blast. Omari, let the listeners know where they can find you and everything you're doing.
Sure thing. And I'll reiterate, it's nice to finally... I guess we're not putting ink to paper, but, voices into the interwebs. But just nice to finally do this after planning it for so long. And yeah, we'll be back every Tuesday. So follow me on Twitter at my first and last name. That's OMARISANKOFA.
And you can follow me on Twitter at Motor City Hoops. Make sure you come back next Tuesday and every Tuesday for the weekly episodes of the Pistons Pulse. And we'll have special episodes around the NBA Draft Lottery, the offseason, the NBA Draft, big games next season, and the trade deadline. And as we will always do, we want to give a very special thank you to the Detroit Free Press and everyone there that is behind us making this happen, with special thanks to editor Kerry Jr. II, executive producer Anjanette Delgado, and executive producer Kirkland Crawford. And of course, our guy producing the podcast, Wes Davenport. We also want to thank all of you for listening to the first installment of The Pistons Pulse. Please give us a rating, subscribe, comment, and go tell a friend about the podcast. Thank you, go Pistons, and we'll talk to you soon.